for doing this, John. I appreciate it, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So, John, I mean, your bio, where do you even start?
It's been a long journey. It's been now 25 years as a professional photographer, professional wildlife photographer.
You were born in 69, a great year, many awesome muscle cars, great music. During that time, you speak about Lake Louise, life out there. Uh, so this has almost been in your blood to be outside, and being cooped up is not who John really is.
No,
Um,
yeah, that's what you're referencing is a picture of with my mother actually, and mother and
yes, Mother's
grandmother
Day.
at the ice fields, Columbia ice fields, when I was 1 years old. So it started very early for me. My parents would come and camp in the Rockies. I grew up in Salmon Arm in British Columbia, and my parents would come and camp in the Rockies several times a summer every year. I was lucky they were teachers, so they had the whole summer off. And so I grew up fishing with my dad all over British Columbia and Alberta, and really getting into hiking very early, camping, and have just continued it on for the full 50 years, really 50 plus years now. I'm 52. So it's been, I just got back last night from a 10-day camping trip with my family. So we were off looking for grizzlies in the Rockies, and had a little bit of luck. So that was fun. So yeah, it's just, it's always been in my blood.
Wow, that's amazing. And when you started photography, did you know this is the path I want to go on? Because most oftentimes, um, photographers, it's a tough journey to get out there, to get your name out there, to start. Was it difficult for you, John, to get going and
Yeah,
then
I guess when
push through
I,
the tough times?
yeah, when I started, I I guess right off the bat, I wanted to be a professional wildlife photographer. I didn't know if that could happen. And I had my very first sale was in 1996, so 26 years ago, to Canadian Geographic. And I kind of thought, okay, woo, big, big start. Here we go. I opened a bank account, got a trade name, and just expected the money to flow in. And it did not. I grossed $717 that first year. So not exactly paying my expenses or paying for any new gear or
No.
barely anything. So it took me 4 years to slowly transition that to a full-time gig. I was very fortunate. My in or my niche was that I came from a background of designing websites. And so when I started my photography in 1996, I designed a website for myself. And I was really the first photographer in Canada, or one of the very first to have their own website. And so that gained me a bunch of followers right off the bat. So I was sort of first into the digital age, if you will, onto the internet at a very early period. And that allowed me to kind of get my foot in the door and slowly start making a bit of money and get in with a few magazines, because I was already on email and I was already using a website for my portfolio. And so I was able to contact editors, and instead of sending in slides back in the day or photos back in the day, I was just sending them a link. And for them, it was, a whole easy new process. Oh, let's go look at this new guy's stuff. And there it was. So it was something that just sort of very fortuitous, and it was good business sense, I guess, on my part to do that. And so by the year 2000, I turned full time. First couple of years was a huge struggle. I remember having to go to the bank of mom and dad twice just to pay my rent in the first year that I went full time, because I mean, still to this day, the money is never regular. So I don't get a regular paycheck at any point. I might have 1 month where I make 20 grand, and then if I spend it all, the next month I might not make anything. So I got to be very careful with where I allot money and figure out my
Absolutely.
trips and all that kind of stuff.
And especially the gear, the lenses, that's not cheap. It's can range from, well, let's just say thousands to the high thousands.
Yeah, I mean, on any given point, when I go and I check my bag for a trip, and I'm going off going on any airline, and they try and sometimes take my bag away from me because it's quite big and it weighs really close to the limit. It's basically 23 pounds or 10 kilos right on the button. And so often they'll try and get me to check it. And I say, well, it's got 25 grand worth of camera gear, and that's not an exaggeration.
Yeah.
Do you really want to check it? And you guys take the responsibility for that. And of course, that always, they don't want to take that responsibility. So I always end up getting to carry it on and put it above me in the regular airline seating, and put it up and carry on.
You've done a couple books prior, well, you've done many books, but your early book, your first one, it's neat that you were ahead of the curve on a lot of things. So Instagram wasn't around and all of these things weren't around. The old school way of going to a gift shop or visiting Banff with your family, or individuals from out of town would come in and see this and say, huh, that is neat. And they would take that as a souvenir to cherish. And like you said, it's a great coffee table piece. So beating those curves, selling over 18,000 copies of your first book, what was that like for you? I mean, this is your own eyes that have seen these places and captured these moments and paused that beautiful animal or landscape for that time being that we can cherish forever.
Yeah, it was a business decision. So I did up spreadsheets and I figured out, okay, if I do this book and this is what it's going to cost to produce, and I did the whole publishing myself.
Wow.
This was my Banff and Lake Louise coffee table book. It was my first coffee table book. It was my second book. I had done a guidebook for wildlife way back in 1997 that sold about 15,000 copies as well. So it's done quite well. But it was through a publisher. So all I had to do was write the words and give them the photos, and everything else was done. My Banff and Lake Louise book was really a passion project that was also a very much a business project. It was to take me to the next level in my income. And so I planned it all out from start to finish, designers, where I got it printed, how it was getting delivered to me, distribution, hired distributors, got it and went personally into all the gift shops and was figuring out, okay, if I do this book and this is what it's going to look like, how many do you think you can sell in a year? And having the gift shop owners tell me, and I went all over Banff National Park through every gift shop that could possibly sell it, and ended up doing the project in 2007, created a beautiful book design and everything with a designer out of Calgary, Richard Murrock from Ivy Design. And it ended up being hugely successful, sold about 4,000 copies the first year, and it is now just over 23,000 copies since 2007. So it's now considered an international bestseller, which is pretty cool to see that success level. And the cool part about me self-publishing it, doing it myself, was I make all the profits. So if I go through a publisher, it lessens my risk considerably, but then I only get just a royalty off the book sales. Whereas me publishing that book myself, I made all the profits from it. So big risk, but big reward.
There's the Pipestone wolves. When we talk about it, you've have books on bears, most recently the Kootenay wolves, but the Pipestone wolves, that's an interesting species, and you capturing that just blew my mind.
Yeah, so the Pipestone wolves was the first one that I did since that early wildlife guidebook. The first one that I did with a publisher again, it was my first book with Rocky Mountain Books. And it was a great experience going out, spending 5 years in the field with researcher Günther Bloch, who ended up writing the book. He actually wrote it in German and then translated it to English himself. And then I had to come in and sort of turn it into decent English. Günther had all the stories and all the data was there, but it was just, before we got it to the publisher, it had to be,
it's broken. Yeah.
Yeah, it was, it's his second language. You can't expect him to be doing a perfect version of English when he translated it over. So it was a really cool to see then Rocky Mountain Books take that, turn it into a great design. But for me, the real joy in it was the 5 years being out in the field. And there were a couple of years where I was out in the field tracking wolves over 200 days. So more than half the year. So very fortunate to have a very forgiving wife. It was before I had children, so allowed me to go out and, spend that much time out there. Get some really amazing emotional photographs and some super cool stories that happened. It was just really interesting to be out there and to be able to dedicate that much time to one project.
No, for sure. For the listeners, John, what were the Pipestone wolves?
Yeah, so the Pipestone wolves were a wolf pack that took over in the Bow Valley between Banff and Lake Louise in Banff National Park, so in protected national park land. They were a wolf pack that took over from the Bow Valley wolf pack, which had been their predecessor. And they came in all of a sudden in 2008, 2009, we think killed off the final remainder of the Bow Valley pack, and then basically established themselves and dominated and ruled the Bow Valley as a very successful wolf pack for 4 or 5 years. But then the impacts of tourism and of wolf viewing and of the highway and railway and just the overall mass tourism going on in Banff National Park finally caught up to the pack. And as the adults started to age, all of a sudden, they started running into problems. And in the end, it ended up being a kind of a sad story, you know, a blazing success for a few years, and then the decline as the family slowly disappeared from the Bow Valley. And we were briefly left with no wolves whatsoever in that portion of Banff National Park, which was, you know, really kind of a shame, because it's a part of the park that has lots of elk and deer and sheep and lots of prey. You know, just wolves always have had trouble surviving right in the middle of Banff with so many people being there.
It's interesting because the elk survive. What would it be for the reasons that wolves cannot survive? Is it just maybe?
Well, they do survive. You know, wolves are an incredibly resilient species, and they always manage to come back. So it's, you know, the individual family that did not survive. Now there's a wolf pack back in that has moved in 2017 or 2016, sorry. It really started first arriving in 2015, but established themselves in 2016 after the Pipestones were already gone. So now there is a new wolf pack in there called the Banff Town Pack, which again is a Bow Valley wolf pack. But they've also run into problems. You know, they've had 2 of their members were shot by Parks Canada back in 2017 because they were going into campgrounds and looking for human food. And there's just so many challenges with the Bow Valley. For those that are familiar with it, it's the area between Banff and Lake Louise. It's got 8 million vehicles a year that goes through it. It's got a national railway. It's got a couple secondary highways, 3 ski hills, a golf course, the resort town of Banff, which at any given time has 30 to 45,000 people living and residing there or staying in the hotels there. There are hotels dotted all over the place throughout the valley. It's really just a maze of human development. And it's really quite remarkable that wolves and grizzly bears and cougars and all these other animals can actually survive and figure out a way to last 4 or 5 years and live decent lives in this maze of human development. So that's part of what the Pipestone book was, is that it was a testament to the wolves, but also really detailed the struggles that they face. And that's also what my newest book, The Kootenay Wolves, goes into as well.
Yes. And you followed them again for 5 years.
I did. Yeah, I did a 5-year project again from 2012 to just into the tip of 2018. So it was actually like a 5.5-year project. And yeah, you just held up the book there. So that was a much more challenging project for me. You're holding up one of the double page spreads of one of the rare times where I actually managed to get the wolf pack on the road. So it was a completely different project than the Pipestone wolves. The Pipestone one, because of all the road access and because I was working with Günther, who was very, very good at finding wolves, oftentimes the wolves would be right off the road or right on the road on the Bow Valley Parkway, the Trans-Canada Highway, on the railway, in areas that you could access. The Kootenay Wolves was a project that came about in a completely different way. It was actually a Parks Canada friend of mine that alerted me to the fact that there was a wolf pack down there. And I had been down lots into Kootenay and had hardly ever seen wolves in there. And it turned out to be this very secretive, elusive wolf family that had lived there for years. I don't actually know how far back their lineage goes. But I stepped in 2012 and started trying to follow them and figure out their patterns. And I was completely on my own. Even my friends at Parks Canada really had no idea. They didn't know where the den site was. They didn't know where any of the rendezvous sites, which is where the family gathers and the pups are left there with a babysitter wolf. So I had to figure out all of that stuff, and they didn't use the road very much. So I was driving down and then hiking off and radiating off of the road into Kootenay National Park, which is also a protected area between Castle Mountain and Banff National Park. And then at the southern end of it is Radium Hot Springs. So it's 110 kilometers long, but it's only 10 kilometers wide. So it's not a particularly wide park, sorry, 10 kilometers on each side wide. So it's not a particularly wide park. It was actually created when the government of British Columbia made a deal with the federal government, and they traded land for this national park in return for the federal government building a road down to Radium and Fairmont Hot Springs and Cranbrook and so on. So they protected the area around this road. So I would hike off from the road and try and figure out where these wolves were. And over 5 years, it was a thrilling project, you know, trying to use my senses and all these abilities I had developed over the years as an outdoorsman, you know, as a tracker, tracking in snow, tracking in early morning dew in, you know, 5 a.m. in June, trying to figure out patterns. And, you know, is that dew pattern in the snow, is that a wolf or is it a moose or is it a deer? And if it's a wolf, what direction is it going? And trying to figure out all this stuff and mapping out and checking Google Earth and going through. I mean, it was a meticulous process of trying to figure out. I had actually a Google Earth loaded on my phone so that even when I was out of cell service, I could pull it up and I could go in and go, okay, I'm here right now. What are some potential areas around here that you know, where might these wolves be headed right now? And so it was like this gigantic detective story that I was unlocking. And the book is really just leading people through this 5-year process of how I slowly gained more and more information and slowly really got accepted by the pack, by the family. You know, I was so careful from an ethical standpoint to not be disturbing them, but you know, it's impossible for them not to know that I'm there at some point and to know that there's a human trying to figure out what they're doing. You know, they've got such amazing senses. You know, they've got the same eyesight we've got, maybe even a little better. They've got better hearing than us. Their sense of smell is better than a bloodhound's. So that's really their top sense. So, you know, it's me trying to sneak in and get photographs of a family of wolves. And really the only thing I had on my side, my only advantage was that I could go, you know, use the wind to my advantage so that the wind was blowing from them to me. And the second thing I had, my biggest advantage, was the fact that they never knew when I might be coming. And I mixed it up tremendously. I never, ever would go into rendezvous sites or den sites every single day because I didn't want them to get used to me continuously, the smell or the, you know, whatever, being in the area. So I would mix it up a lot. And so they never knew when I was coming. And that worked to my advantage a lot because I was able to then go in and sneak in. And sometimes I was coming into a rendezvous spot. For instance, I'd have picked my spot and it's a little camouflage spot, poking my lens between a tree branches. And I'm wearing full camo from head to toe, just my eyeballs sticking out and my mouth. And I would sneak in there and it might take me, the final 100 meters might take me half an hour. Just going step by step by step, being so careful not to crack a twig, crinkle a leaf. If I saw a wolf and could see them, then I would have to absolutely freeze and not move until I was sure they were out of sight again. And then I'd get into my spot, slowly raise my camera up and stick it through the branches, and then just wait for wolves to walk into my field of view. So oftentimes I wouldn't get anything. You know, I'd sit there all day and I'd see fleeting glimpses of wolves moving around in the trees, but I wouldn't actually necessarily get photographs. So it was thrilling. It was extremely tiring. You know, I was sometimes leaving my home in Canmore at 2:30 in the morning, driving down in the dark, hiking in the dark, sitting there all day, you know, peeing into a bottle at times.
Oh, yeah.
You know, having little naps, cat naps in the field, and then leaving in the dark and getting home at 1 in the morning. And so it's pretty obvious why I couldn't just keep doing it over and over again. You know, I was getting physically and mentally exhausted, but it was an incredible project. I discovered partway through that this family was actually leaving the national park for huge chunks of time. and getting exposed to trappers and trophy hunters and everything else that happens on provincial lands that aren't protected. As soon as you leave that national park, there's this whole new set of dangers that are even worse than all the traffic and so on in the national parks, much, much worse. And so I would often spend my winters going down and hoping that I wasn't going to run into my wolves. Well, I called them my wolves at that point, as I got deep into
they're
the
your
process.
family. Yeah.
Yes, I was very emotionally bonded with them or tied to them. And I was so worried I was going to find their bodies, on the side of the road where they've been shot or in a trapper's snare set. So that really became a huge part of the book of, what really does happen on provincial lands with our wild wolves, how unregulated it really is and the tremendous dangers that they face. And we're just really, really fortunate in British Columbia and Alberta and in Canada in general that wolves are such a resilient species and can breed very quickly to replace themselves. So, they can get threatened, they can get wiped out areas, but they can come back again. And Banff National Park is Banff and Kootenay are great examples of that. Wolves got completely wiped out of there in the 1950s when there was a huge eradication program nationally to help eradicate rabies. There was this big scare. And so they went out and just basically decimated wildlife populations, the canids, the foxes and coyotes and wolves all throughout Western Canada. And even out into Ontario. Anyways, so
it's pretty much a culling.
Pretty much a culling, yeah, and extremely effective.Using poisons, the whole 9 yards. Terribly unethical. So wolves actually had disappeared from Banff and Kootenay altogether, and there were just fringe wolf populations right at the top of Jasper National Park, and slowly they came back in and repopulated. I mean, I remember stories. From some of the wardens talking about when they would first see wolves, the odd wolf floating through Kootenay or Banff in the 1970s, and be going, no way. And actually at that point, they were still shooting them. Going, oh, shoot, it's a wolf, boom, get it out of there. Thankfully in the 1980s, they started to actually repopulate and get a foothold again. And by that point, Parks Canada was actually protecting all wildlife, not just the Bambis. So wolves were able to get a grip again and slowly come back in and help restore some of the balance in our national parks. That was
how come the Pipestone wolves weren't able to breed as fast in order to keep their pack alive?
Well, they were able to breed. What happened though is when the mating pair, the lead pair of wolves, sometimes called the alpha male and alpha female, although that's kind of gone out of vogue now. That's not really used by biologists anymore. But the lead female, the lead male, who in that case were Faith and Spirit with the Pipestone wolves, once they got fairly old and started to run into health issues, and once they fade away, once they're killed, it's very, very difficult for the pack to retain itself, even with a whole bunch of pups and younger adults. They're sort of the guiding force. And when you lose those lead males and females, oftentimes a wolf pack has a real struggle to survive no matter what. And when you throw in all the stuff that was going on in Banff National Park, it just made it 10 times harder. And you saw the exact same thing with the pack before that called the Bow Valley Wolves. When their lead female, Delinda, was hit on the highway in August of 2008, the whole pack just unraveled. And just sort of the final process was the Pipestones coming in and killing off the final few wolves and taking over. So with the Pipestones, it was much different. The wolves just sort of, as they got a bit older and had more trouble hunting, these lead wolves, Faith and Spirit, it really became, as soon as they died, the pack just unraveled immediately and died off very, very quickly.
Is it because they go on their own? They separate from each other?
Try and separate on their own, and they just don't have the same knowledge that their parents have. And it kind of unravels very quickly. And what often happens, particularly as you go out into provincial lands where there's all the hunting and trapping going on, and you have these lead males and females that are continuously getting trapped or shot, all their pups are just continuously spreading out and trying to start new packs elsewhere. And it's just a really, it creates additional livestock conflicts. It creates additional conflict with prey bases, the deer and the elk and the moose and stuff. It's just it's a continuous sort of whirlwind of stuff never really getting established. Packs and families never really getting established properly. And from a biological standpoint, it's just not a great way to manage wildlife.
When people stop over and say, "Oh, a wolf on the side of the road or a bear," and they get out and they start taking photos, and the bear does something or gets a little too close, a ranger will come and oftentimes shoot the bear or scare the bear or whatever. It's beautiful to see that you do it from a distance with ethics, with care, value, and know that you're going into their territory, whatever they have left in Mother Nature. And it's beautiful you do it so delicately, because oftentimes people just get their phone out and want that capture, and then if the animal does something, it's the animal's fault.
Right. Yeah, and it is a very fine line to walk as a wildlife photographer,
Right.
because there are times when, if I stop, that might start a traffic jam, a bear jam, a wolf jam, whatever. So I have to be very, very cognizant of, what I'm doing, what people see me doing. And so with the Kootenay Wolf Project, it was really important to me to put the welfare of the wolves first. There were lots of times where if I had stepped 1 foot to the left or couple feet to the right and exposed myself, I would have got some great pictures. The wolves all would have looked at me and I would have got amazing pictures, but I would have disturbed them. They would have known I was there. They would have left. They might have abandoned the rendezvous site, things like that. So there were lots of times where I sat there and I just realized, I'm not going to get a photo today.
No.
Too bad for me, but that's the way it is. And that's how it's going to have to be for this project. And I have very, strict guidelines for myself that I stuck to. There were times when the wolves came close to me, often unknowingly. I've got a couple stories of the wolf pups in there where they would approach me, and one in particular where a wolf pup approached me to about 30 meters away, way closer than I wanted to be, where I was with my big lens basically getting its head. Yeah. And I took a couple shots and then went, okay, it's still coming closer. And so I actually stopped taking photographs and looked outside my lens and said, "Hey, buddy." And the wolf pup just froze and looked around trying to figure out, and I went, "Hey, buddy, hey, buddy." And it started coming closer again. I went, "Okay, hey, buddy, that's enough."
Yeah, enough. Stop.
And then I moved my arm. And even though it was camouflaged, the pup saw my arm move then, and then quickly turned and ran away. Yeah. And, the most amazing part of that encounter is watching it run away and then run into its other pups back in the distance, which I can sort of see through the trees, and they all start playing and romping around. So it never did associate that there's a human. It was probably never even seen a human at that point in its life. Never did associate the danger, or not that there's a danger of me being there, but there's a danger in them getting habituated too much to a human presence, if that human were then to start feeding them and they associate a human with food. These wolves are all habituated to some degree. They're living in a national park with humans all around, but they've adapted to that. These Kootenay wolves, there were times when, I would walk down a trail and they would walk down the trail half an hour behind me, so they obviously can smell me. They're not dumb. They're incredibly brilliant animals.
Are they afraid of humans?
To a degree, certainly. I would really see their behavior change when they left the national park. So they were smart enough to know, the lead male and female, Whitey and Mum is who I called them, were smart enough to know when they left the national park that for some reason danger would increase to them, particularly from people, humans. So they were much more wary around human smells. I often had much more difficulty getting photographs of them once they would leave the protected area of the park, even when they would get into the south end of the park, which is close to the border where they would then leave the park and go onto provincial lands. So it was a dramatic difference in photographs I would get in the northern part of the park, where they seemed to feel much more comfortable, to the southern part of the park and outside of the park, where they were so much more wary and just worried about getting into a snare, being shot by somebody off the road, that kind of thing.
Were you nervous, John, to see a wolf caught in a snare or trapped or shot? Or had you ever seen that before?
I've actually never run into a wolf caught in a snare. I've been very, very close. I had a couple of years ago in Kananaskis country, my Exposed Wildlife Conservancy that I co-founded actually did a brief documentary on this encounter that a fellow had in Kananaskis, and he encountered a live wolf caught in a snare by its leg. And he phoned me 24 hours later, and I rushed down there, and I was too late. The wolf had been killed by that point by the trapper. So within that 48-hour period. But I have found wolves skinned out, just the carcass laying there at the side of a snare set. So a snare set is basically their metal loops. They're placed around bait. So roadkill, dead moose, dead cow, dead pig, whatever. They drag it into the forest. Then they set all these snares around, tie them to trees. So when the wolf walks through them and comes into that, as its head goes through, the snare tightens around it and chokes the wolf to death slowly. It's not a fast process at all. So I was always terrified that I was going to run into one of my wolves, or any wolf for that matter, in these snare sets that I was checking regularly outside of the national park. And fortunately, I never did find one of my wolves in there, one of the Kootenay wolves in there. But there were a lot of winters where several wolves would just disappear. And I never did know what happened. You know, did they disperse? Did they go off to try and form their own pack? Or did they get shot? Or did they get trapped?
So it's not at all a humane way of a kill, even if you want.
No, it's not. It's you know, and that's one of the things that I've, you know, as a wildlife photographer, I'm very fortunate that I've got a voice, and then a lot of people follow me on social media, on things like this, you know, podcasts and stuff, and listen to what I say, or at least consider what I say. And right now, one of my major projects that I'm working on is to get snares banned in Canada. You know, it's a long process. It's not going to happen immediately, but it is a very inhumane, unethical way of killing wildlife. It's very unregulated. People literally make snares at home. So there's no regulation on what's going out there. And it has scientifically been proven to not kill wildlife within what are supposed to be our standards. Canada, as a trapping nation, signed on to an international trapping agreement. And as part of signing on, so that part of the agreement was that traps should kill within 3 minutes. Canada only signed on under the agreement that snares would be excluded from that agreement. So Canada signed on to this big ethical trapping agreement, yet they only signed on because they were allowed to pull snares out of the agreement. So everybody in Canada can still trap with snares, knowing full well that it's not a humane, ethical way of killing wolves, foxes, coyotes, beavers, whatever.
So the snares, how you explain that, and then there's the actual trap where it goes on your paw or your claw.
Right. Leg hold trap, yeah.
Yeah. Are those banned yet, or are those still?
So the leg hold traps that have the steel, the jaws are banned now, thankfully. The ones that are just a more, so they're like a padded steel trap, and they clamp on the leg and then just hold the animal. So they're called a holding trap. Those are not yet banned. And so the interesting thing about those, and really quite terrible, is so you can set those in Alberta, British Columbia, wherever, and the trapper has to check them every 24 to 48 hours, depending on different jurisdictions have different time lengths. But the animal just sits in them the whole time with their leg broken or their leg, you know, tightly clamped. And there are foxes and wolves that chew their leg off, do all kinds of things to try and get out of it, because it's a restraining trap. You know, they're literally dealing with this horrible trap holding them in place. So not a trap that I'm a super big fan of either. But at least that one gets checked. Snares, there's not even regulations to check them.
Well, imagine 24 hours would sound like 7 days to a human being.
Oh, totally. Like, imagine being, you know, someone comes in right now and clamps a super hard pressurized couple of bars on your arm, and you're just sitting there for 24 hours till someone comes and shoots you in the head. You know, it's pretty terrible.
I mean, do you ever get nervous walking around and maybe ending up in one of those, or your leg touches something? And
that's a great question. I am, you know, because a lot of people ask me, do you ever get nervous walking around with wolves and bears and cougars and all this stuff? And the truth is, I don't really. I'm really respectful. I'm very, very careful. I make noise when I'm in bear country. When I was doing all these wolf projects, I had to be very, very careful of not running into a bear. And so there were certain rendezvous areas, things like that, that I wouldn't even go into because it's berry season and there's grizzlies feeding on, I might run into a bear. I can't sneak in quietly. So I'm just not going to sneak in, period, because I'm not going to put myself at risk or that animal at risk. So what I was always more worried about was running into, having a hunter shoot me by accident or on purpose, or running into a leg hold trap. Absolutely. Because I do regularly go and check several different trap lines. And that is a very real worry, because trappers, they do not have to put out signs. They don't have to mark their traps. It's really a very unregulated industry, and it's very much a fringe industry at this point. I won't. There's indigenous trappers out there, and I'm not going to get into that at all. They have their rights. It's not my person as I'm actually do have a bit of Métis heritage, but it's still not my place
for sure
to be telling indigenous people what their rights are and are not. That is their right, their treaty rights and their unceded treaty rights in British Columbia to go out and trap and work the land and do what they want with it. But everybody else, it's very much a fringe industry. It's, at this point, primarily a bunch of older white guys out there trapping as a recreational hobby, out there killing stuff and managing wildlife.
That's what we hear. We hear that a lot. Managing population. That's why we need to do it. It's population control. If we don't do it, it affects the ecosystem.
Yeah, which
true,
of course,
John? What do you think?
Which is total BS, of course. I've got a degree in wildlife management, and you learn very early on that that's total BS. You don't need to be out there managing a predator like a wolf. It's an apex predator. It's top of the food chain. They manage their own numbers. If prey is low, they don't have a lot of pups. If there's competition between wolf packs, they'll kill each other. They have their very own, very set system that goes back thousands of years, tens of thousands of years on managing their own population numbers. And so they don't, it makes absolutely no sense that wolves would go into a valley and clean it out, an ecosystem, and clean it out completely of prey. What would they eat then? It's like, well, humans, we don't go and kill all of our cattle the very first year. That would be stupid. So wolves are smart animals. They don't go and kill all their prey right away, and it makes absolutely no sense. And it.
Have you had an encounter though of a wolf or a bear or a cougar, for instance, that is a little too close for comfort, and you don't know what to do?
Not really. No, like I said, Zach, I'm super careful. I've always got my safety gear, which for me is a cell phone if I'm in cell range. If I'm not in cell range, then it's called an InReach Explorer. It's a satellite device that I can hit 911. So if I fall through ice, if I get attacked by something, whatever might happen, I can phone an emergency number right away. That'll send in help immediately without any questions asked. So I pay for that service, a monthly fee. I have a big knife with me. I always have my bear spray, and I often also carry an air horn. So I've got sort of my full gamut of safety stuff, but I've never really been put in a position or put myself in a position where, I've had grizzly bears walk super close to me, literally as close as from me to my screen in front of me here, but never in a dangerous way. So it's always been a fleeting encounter, where they've walked by. In fact, one of them is described in the Kootenay Wolves book. I won't go into detail. People can go and buy that if they want to, and hear about the day that a grizzly bear, or read about how the day a grizzly bear walked right past me while I was sitting at a wolf rendezvous site and scared the living daylights out of me. And I've also had some very interesting close cougar encounters, but again, nothing that sort of made me think I was in imminent danger.
Are you terrified at all to go in the forest by yourself? Because at times, I've done it, and I just maybe walk in a few steps, and then I think, okay, time to go.
Yeah, no, I don't really get scared at all. I've been wandering around in the forest by myself since I was like I don't know, 5 or 6, whenever my parents started letting me, I was building blinds out in the Shuswap by Salmon Arm,
Yes.
in the total wilderness, building blinds out there and waiting for the deer to walk by and snap it with my little Kodak Instamatic when I was 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. So, learning how to make fires on my own when I was like 8 years old. I've been doing all this stuff for so long. I'm not quite at an Alone level, the TV show, where you go and set people out there on their own and they have to survive for 50 days. I wouldn't do well in that because I need to eat all the time.
But that's your home. That's your sanctuary. That's probably where you find the most peace.
Yeah.
Is being there with them and understanding them. That is super neat, John. When you look at social media today with, people can use their phone and take a great photo. How can you decipher what's a great shot versus what's a good shot? Because for us, John, you can show me your camera roll and I'll think all of them are beautiful because you're doing things that most people are not, right?
Yeah.
So how do you differ? That is the shot. Is it something that speaks to you? Is it a story? Is it something that resonates?
Yeah, usually for me, it's some sort of an image that tells a story or draws out an emotion. This photograph I have behind me of the cougar, looking curiously at me. I think people, if they look at that photo, whoa, holy cow, that's a cougar. That's crazy. What's the story? So it makes people want to know what the story is. And like, it looks like it's checking you out, and it is checking me out, but not in a predatory manner, but in a curious manner. And that right away opens up a whole box of different questions for people. And I love that about photographs of wolves and some of these apex predators, cougars and grizzly bears and stuff, because there's so much that we don't understand about them. Canada's come from this background of trapping and hunting, and there's sort of this mythological history of, wolves out killing children and, cougars snatching people out of playgrounds and all sorts of stuff. And, sure, there's 1 or 2 instances of, the odd crazy thing happening, but when you actually look at the reality of it, like with wolves, for instance, there's been 1 person in North America killed by a wolf in the last 140 years.
Oh.
You're more likely to get killed sticking your arm in a vending machine and having it fall over on you. Like, it's that ridiculous. You're far more likely to die walking your kid to school than you are by wandering around in the bush and having a wolf kill you. So it's trying to set some of these facts straight and starting to make people realize that, what we may have heard as kids and read in some of the books and stuff, and what we maybe hear from some of the trophy hunters and that side of things, is not really reality when you're out in the bush. These animals are not something to be feared. They're actually critical parts of ecosystems. An animal like a cougar that I've got pictured here is an ecosystem engineer. And that means that when they go out there and they're wandering around in the ecosystem and they kill a deer, for instance, that deer then lays there decomposing. They bury it. The cougar's feeding on it, but so are up to 200 other different species, including beetles that are changing the soil in the forest, that are allowing the forest to grow different types of trees. And so that's what's meant by them being ecosystem engineers, much like a beaver is. Cougars go in and they actually shape the landscape by just simply being there. So they're super important to everything else there, including the deer and the sheep and so on that they're preying on. Many of those animals might not be there or might be in totally different balances if cougars were removed from those ecosystems. So it's the same with wolves and cougars and grizzly bears. They're just integral parts of the ecosystems that they're in. And a lot of ecology and biology nowadays is recognizing that. And we're starting to see conservation biologists that are really pushing the narrative that maybe we don't need to be hunting these apex predators and trapping them so relentlessly, and that maybe we actually should be setting aside more areas, more habitat, and protecting them more. So we're protecting the biodiversity that is falling underneath these apex predators and these top of the food chain predators.
We have the Yamnuska wolf dog sanctuary, I think, but that's as close as we've gotten to a wolf, I'm guessing, because they're not actually wolves, are they? They're wolf dogs.
Well, no, I think the wolves at Yamnuska, I don't know a lot about.
I don't either,
Yamnuska, but I think the wolves there are actually wolves, genetically are fairly full wolves, if not full wolves, but they've been raised in domestic settings, and so they're now part of the Wolfneck Sanctuary. But it's interesting in Canada. We have one grizzly bear sanctuary, so that's the Kootenay out north of Prince Rupert. We don't have any other sanctuaries set aside specifically for predators. We've got our national parks, and that's the only other place where our predators can't be hunted or trapped. But everywhere else, even our provincial parks. So for instance, in British Columbia, everyone thinks of, Mount Robson Provincial Park, Mount Assiniboine, all these gorgeous provincial parks. Well, all of them, you can trap and hunt predators in them still. So they're really not protected areas in that sense. A lot of those provincial parks even still allow some level of industrial development. So logging, mining, things like that. So the habitat even isn't really protected. So the ecosystems certainly aren't as protected as you think they are. So really, we've got our little national parks, and you think of Banff and Jasper, you think, oh, it's huge. I just drove from Jasper to Banff yesterday. It's 3.5 hours, but that's just a dot. You think when I drive from Banff from my home here in Canmore, if I drive out to Winnipeg, for instance, 16-hour drive, I don't go through any protected areas. No. It's all just completely unprotected, cultivated lands, human development everywhere. So when you look at it that side of things, you suddenly think, geez, we got a lot of work to do in Canada still, particularly setting aside habitat. And, really in the end, I think we're probably going to have to come together, the conservationists, the non-hunters with the hunters and the trappers and the non-trappers and everybody, and just go, well, let's just get some habitat protected, and then we can argue about everything after that. Yeah. So that's kind of one of the things I'm working on right now, although still working very hard on getting some of the trapping regulations changed.
On the highways, now they have overpasses for wildlife to go over. But you still hear about these train incidents, highway road kills. Gosh, what can we do? Do we build big barriers so they can't?
I think, it's Banff, of course, is a leader in this, having done, I think it's like 32 underpasses and 6 overpasses, something like this at this point. It's been hugely successful because it now even has female wolverines. Everything has crossed under or over, and meaning that genetics are going back and forth across the Trans-Canada Highway. So now we're seeing it in Kootenay. The next step, I think, will just be expanding it further and further. Jasper's in desperate need of some mitigation on their highways and railways right now. We're going to need mitigation on our railway through the Bow Valley at some point between Banff and Lake Louise. The Icefields Parkway, probably at some point, either is going to need some speed mitigation. I've long been an advocate for putting some speed bumps along there and just making people slow down. And too bad if it takes you 5 hours to go to Jasper. Is it really that terrible if you had to slow down? And it would mean having some sort of emergency system in place where we can get a helicopter in very quickly to road accidents, things like that, or a way to remove speed bumps quickly, where a digital system where they pop into the ground if there's an emergency vehicle coming over them, something like that. But out of the box thinking. We need to start looking at protecting more land just in general, like I was saying.
When you look at, or you've been an advocate for culling. Over the years, what are some of the species that have been called a target, and why have you been so adamant in saying stop this now?
An advocate against the killing.
Against the killing.
Not an advocate for the culling.
Yeah.
Most times culling is a band-aid measure. It's a mitigation that's put in place after something bad has already happened. So for instance, in the Allopech caribou herd, which is one of Alberta's most threatened caribou herds, had declined under 100 animals at one point. And they knew this had been going on for years and decades even. Lots of warnings, lots of groups working to fight and protect habitat. And yet they're still logging in there right up until 2013. So as recently as 2013. And yet they've been doing wolf culls since 2000. So they're killing wolves, yet they're still going in and logging. And we know now that logging the habitat is the critical factor. Logging or building roads in for mining and oil and gas, things like that, that creates access and it changes the habitat. It brings deer and elk and moose into caribou habitat they would not normally ever be in. And then it provides access for wolves to follow those ungulates in. And then because wolves are all of a sudden in caribou habitat, it's much easier. Caribou are easier for them to prey on than elk and deer and moose are. And so caribou just get preyed on, the population comes down. We know exactly how this works now biologically. And so we know the habitat is the key thing to protect. Going in and culling the wolves is just a band-aid measure that allows you to keep going and logging and doing oil and gas and so on
Right.
for decades into the future, and pretending like you're doing something. Oh, well, we spent 3 million on wolf culling. So the elk or the caribou population actually went up by 10. So see, it's working, but not really. It's not. No. Yeah.
Why do they cull the wolves? Why can't you? I mean, again, I don't know much about this, but can't you tranquilize them and move them to a different location?
It doesn't really work relocating. They've looked at sterilizing them. That doesn't really work. In there's a little bit of science on that, but not a lot. By far the clearest science is just protecting the habitat and restoring habitat that is there right now. So, there are instances where I would actually be okay with a wolf cull, predator culls, and that is if all other levers are also being pushed for herds that are in danger. But right now, all I see is just continued industrial development in all these areas. And then the wolf cull is just the Band-Aid measure at the end to make sure that, we're doing something and we're holding the caribou steady. And not in favor of that whatsoever. Just absolutely no excuse for doing that at this point.
Is there an ethical cull in terms of how they've been killed, or is it?
Not really. No, that's the other big issue, is that there's not really an ethical way to go out and cull wolves. Poison is certainly not ethical, and that's what they used in Alberta extensively in the north. They've also done helicopter culls, so they go and they air gun and shoot them from helicopters. That is also, you miss a shot by a couple inches. You can imagine the death or the injuries that wolves would go through. So no, not particularly ethical in any way, but like I said, there are potentially scenarios where I might be able to support it and where there might be a conservation objective, but we haven't run into any of those yet.
No, you said there's no sanctuary, or there's very little work done on sanctuaries for predators. A few years ago, I'd gone to fundraiser, I think it was, for black bears and the orphan bears.
Yes, Northern Lights Wildlife Shelter in
yes.
British Columbia. So that's an organization that I've worked with quite a bit in the past. Most of my followers on social media know that my family went and we volunteered there over the pandemic, and had at that time my 6-month-old son in a backpack while I'm shoveling bear poop in the enclosures. And so it that's an interesting place, because it's one of the few places in the world that does rehabilitation of grizzly bears. And it would be really nice to see that expanded out into other jurisdictions. So here in Alberta, a couple of years ago, we had grizzly sow that was killed and had 3 little tiny cubs left, two or three, I can't remember if it was 2 or 3, that were orphaned, and instead they just went to a zoo. If there had been a rehab program in place, they could have gone to the rehab program, been rehabilitated, released back into the wild, and helped bolster the population of grizzly bears are still a threatened species in Alberta. So it's stuff like that I don't really understand why we haven't taken those extra steps. There's a lot of stuff in wildlife conservation and wildlife management that kind of gets pushed under the rug or just not thought about, and we just keep doing things the same old way and expecting stuff to change. And it, I think we're going to see a renaissance of new ideas and new management coming in the next 10, 20, 30 years, particularly as we get Indigenous-led conservation coming to the forefront more and more.
Do you think the euthanization of orphan cubs, I don't understand that. I really have a hard time with that,
I do too. Yeah, it's been big news in both BC and Alberta over the last couple of decades when it has happened. And it's a tough one. I don't really know. I think we've made big strides towards that, though, towards these cubs going into rehab and getting a second chance at life.
John, before we get going here, what do you hope in the next 10, 20 years as a conservationist, as a person that calls the forest his home? It's your peace, it's your sanctuary. What do you see, and what do you hope for?
I guess I hope first and foremost that we start protecting more land. There's got to be big chunks of it set aside. I would love to see things like a mountain lion refuge set aside somewhere in BC or Alberta, that's just set as a core area where every other industrial use and so on reverberates or centers around this mountain lion refuge. And this is an idea that's been out for a few years now. Dr. Mark Bloch out of the US has been a big proponent of it. So things like that, knowing for sure that we've set aside this habitat, then we can get more into the nuts and bolts of wildlife management. I have a lot of issues with how our wildlife is managed in Western Canada and beyond. Largely unregulated trapping industry, very fringe group of hobbyists that are recreational trappers that are really determining what's happening out there in our wilderness. For all of us people that like me, that why can't I have a share in determining what's happening out there in our wilderness? I'm the one working out there full time. I'm not a weekend warrior out there just going out and killing stuff. I actually have a role in helping to keep that wildlife alive. And so I want to see some big strides made towards everything from banning snares to changing how we manage wildlife, bringing in the Indigenous perspective, this two-pronged approach to Western science meets traditional ecological knowledge. I really want to see way more of that brought into play. So that's kind of what I would like to see 20 years from now. And as my son kind of reaches his early 20s at that point, it'd be awesome to see him, seeing a world that is changing, where we've brought biodiversity as a major topic and is front and center with how we manage everything. Climate change has been brought under control a bit more. We've started to make big strides and things like that. That's what I want to see.
When you left the project, the 5 years following the Kootenays, the wolves in the Kootenays, what was it like for you, that feeling? And how did you know, okay, it's time to say my goodbye and I'm leaving? It's hard because that's 5 years. I mean, even a year is a lot.
Yeah, it was, I set a very strict deadline for myself. And I had decided back in like 2013 that it was going to be a 5-year project, and I actually said it was like 5 years and 3 months. So it spilled into 2018 slightly. And that was just to get in that last trapping season, to make sure that the wolves had made it through one more winter. And that, that's kind of my final thing, was knowing that they had made it into 2018 and then just leaving, walking away completely cold turkey. And it was hard to do because, I for 10 years, including that Pipestone wolf project right before, I've been completely addicted to wolves. For 10 years, they were a part of my daily routine. Oftentimes I'd go out every single day of the month, doing at least something out there, not necessarily going into the rendezvous sites every day or things like that, but going out and checking out a new area and checking for tracks and just familiarizing myself with every square inch of their territories. And so going cold turkey was like, literally like quitting something. And it was terrible, but at the same time, I felt a real sense of pride that I was able to do it and successfully walk away and know that the pack was still there, and I never did find out what happened. That to me is part of the glorious, it's giving away a little bit of the ending, not all of it. People are gonna have to go read the book because there's something really cool happens at the end. But yeah, just that it, I was able to walk away, and those wolves were still out there doing what they'd been doing when I started the project. And to me, that's the ultimate as a wildlife photographer. Even every single encounter I have, I want to walk into it, and when I leave that encounter, I want the animal still doing what it was doing when I got there.
Is it difficult for you to see them hunt another animal, because you're a lover, of course, of animals? And
great question. Not really. No, I love to see the hunt. It's super rare. I've hardly seen any complete kills. I've seen it actually. The best one I ever saw, I didn't even get to photograph because it was too dark. Seeing the Kootenay wolves pull down a deer, and I couldn't photograph it, but it was amazing to actually see in person. And it's actually not part of the book. It wasn't. It was one of I've got thousands of stories that didn't make it into the book, but yeah, no, it's interesting because when wolves or most predators kill an animal, the animal doesn't suffer for long. It's not like sitting in a trap for 24 hours, or it's not the way we kill things. We, of course, if you're a good hunter, you can make a good, quick, clean kill shot. But wolves go in, and that deer was, from when they first started pulling at its hamstrings to when it was down and dead was, 5-6 minutes tops. So that was really cool to see, and I've seen that a couple of times now. So it's the flip side of it, you also see lots and lots of times where wolves test an animal and then don't you think out there, they're these bloodthirsty killers. They just, if they see a moose, that's it, the moose is done for. Well, I remember this cow moose that I watched the Pipestone wolves approach like 7 different times over 3 years, and not once did they even try and get her. And same cow moose, so obviously she's been living right in the middle of their territory for 3 years. All these probably hundreds of times they've encountered each other that I don't see, and the wolves never, they just know, nope, she's not something we can get right now. And I don't think people understand that. A lot of, you hear some of these, old bushmen making these claims of, the wolves go in and they just kill everything. Well, they just can't. Even if they wanted to, they can't kill the big healthy elk and the big healthy moose. That's too daunting of a task for most of them.
No, I mean, us as humans, John, you and I, there's grocery stores all around us. It's not like you and I can just go in there and just scavenge and grab everything and eat it. We might like food or love food, but we're not going to do that, right?
Right. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for this, John. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. It was good to meet you, and
yes,
really had fun.
And you have a few tours that people can do. Go on your website.
I do, yes. If they go online and look up Canadian Wildlife Photography Tours with John E. Marriott, they'll see all kinds of photo tours they can go on.
Awesome. Thanks again, John, for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Zach.